Okay, to help you understand more about what's going on in your brain and how that affects you in terms of your behaviors, I'm going to start by just drawing a really simple diagram of your brain. So to begin with, I'm going to start with part of your brain that's located here. That's the prefrontal cortex, and that's called the reasonable mind. This place here is where we process information in a very logical way. We can look at facts, and we can also do good problem solving. The other part of the brain over here, this is where we have our emotion mind. Now, you may have heard of this emotion mind. That's called the amygdala. That's the side of the fight or flight response. And most people that I work with, at least when they first start to see me, want to get rid of that part of their thinking and their way of operating. The emotion mind is very important, however, and we know that people who accidentally have it removed through an accident or some other trauma have a lot of problems even making decisions. So I just want to talk a little bit about the emotion mind, and then we'll talk about how these two kind of fit together. So the emotion mind has three primary functions. Those functions are, first of all, for you to understand yourself, for you to be able to communicate with others, and also for you to motivate action. So we know that we have these three primary functions. Let's have a look at how they get overlaid in terms of our emotions. So when we have a high emotion, and you can see here I've got a scale of 0 to 10, let's call it anxiety, we have a strong urge to respond or act. Now that action is usually to bring about some short-term relief. Unfortunately, it's not always going to be the thing that's best for the long term, though. In order to consider things for the long run, what we need to be able to do is to bring our anxiety down, and that allows us to think through things more clearly. And sometimes that's done in little bunny hops like this. When we're back into this space where our emotion is lower, as you can see in this diagram, that's when we get an overlap with reasonable mind. It's where we can think a bit more logically and a bit more, do more problem solving, and generally we can see the situation more clearly. That's what we call wise mind. Wise mind is the intersection between emotion mind and reasonable mind. And this is the place we want to be in order to make good decisions, to be able to communicate effectively, and also to engage in actions that have better long-term outcomes. So talking that through a little bit more, let's talk about this idea of emotions and urges to act. So if I pick up on this for a sec, in terms of anxiety, what we can see is when we get anxious, we have a strong urge to do what? If you think about giving a speech or a presentation, or maybe it's doing something like a bungee jump, what is the urge that you have when you feel anxious about something? We all want to avoid. Unfortunately, if we avoid the situation, it can lead to the anxiety getting bigger. So when we are experiencing that situation again or that trigger, unfortunately, the anxiety doesn't go down, it comes back up again. And this is what creates an anxiety disorder. Let me unpack this a little bit more because this is a really important point. So I'm just going to put that aside for a minute and we'll come back to how this all fits together. So you can see here in this diagram, I've got a scenario for you. So imagine that you are walking to work and that you go through a park. And so we've got here time here, and we've also got distress up here, anxiety. All right. On your way to the park, and you're leaving home, of course, on your way to the park, on a particular day, everything's going well, and then you're halfway through the park and you get bitten by a dog. What would you imagine feeling the next day as you approach that same situation? Chances are you would have got dressed normally, you would have been heading into work, but at the point that you're actually in the park where the dog bit you, there might be an increase in your anxiety. Of course, it's really adaptive. At that point, you might decide, actually, I don't want to walk in that direction. I'm going to take another way. And you avoid. Then the next day, you're getting ready and you're thinking, you know what? I never really liked to walk in the park in the first place. Maybe what I'm going to do this time is I'm actually going to walk a different way. That's a bit like before even getting into the situation now, before getting into the park, you're already thinking about what's about to come up. And that desire to avoid gets stronger and stronger. So instead of actually getting into the park, you've decided you're going to walk a different way. It's not uncommon for this to even get worse, where people then decide, you know what, I really don't like walking to work. I'm actually going to drive. So before getting anywhere near the park or the situation where the dog was, they've decided to completely change what they're doing. This process is what drives an anxiety disorder. What a person actually needs to be able to do is to ride out that awful distress and feel that they're okay, they can deal with it, and actually they didn't get bitten by a dog again. That ability to ride out their distress and see it down the other end allows them to feel safe around those cues like the park, other dogs, and we'd need to build that in. But it's only through going through that process of feeling the distress that they're able to get back down to their baseline again and eventually not even think about dogs and being bitten or parks and being fearful. So going back to what I was saying before in terms of what's happening in our mind and what we do in terms of our actions, you can see that it's not just what we feel about things, it's how we act that either makes the emotion worse or better. So in this situation, the outcome of an anxiety disorder for this person, it's a phobia not just of dogs, but now it's of walking through parks in that particular park. And essentially what they need to do is, well, what's the opposite of avoiding? Facing the fear. All good treatments for anxiety help people face their fear. It doesn't matter what the variety of treatment is, they all help people face their fear. And the reason is that we need to do the opposite of what we feel like doing in that situation in order to get to the point where we feel confident again. Extending on this a little bit, we could look at other emotions, we could look at sadness. Let's actually talk that through. So sadness is when we have loss, and that makes us want to withdraw. And when we withdraw, well, what happens? So you're feeling sad, you don't want to go to a party, decide not to go to a party. Does the sadness get higher or lower? Well, chances are you're going to have a secondary emotion of loneliness. But we know that withdrawing and doing that for at least a couple of weeks is going to lead to a very predictable outcome of you, if you sat in front of a health professional, being diagnosed with depression. What we need to be able to do is do the opposite of withdrawing, a bit like you can see in my diagram. So high levels of sadness, we want to pull back like the bunny hops and get back to the point where we're able to re-engage. The opposite of withdrawing is engaging or getting active. Once again, all treatments of depression have a component of what's called behavioral activation. It is the most effective way that we can combat depression. So behavioral activation means getting active, getting out there again, and that leads to us feeling brighter and also happier. In the same way, let's talk about anger, which is another common emotion. This happens when our needs are not met or when we're under threat. What do we all feel like doing when we're angry? Lashing out, attacking. So what is it that we need to do in that situation? What happens when we attack? Well, unfortunately, we damage things and it makes us feel really disconnected. Often makes us feel misunderstood too. So what's the polar opposite action to attacking? We don't attack, we are kind or caring. And what happens when we feel a sense of kindness and care for people? We feel more connected to them, closer. So once again, looking back at our diagram, so when the emotion is high, even though we have the urge to act in the direction of having a short-term relief, we've actually got to do the opposite. And this is where the DBT skills come in.
It's our DBT skills that help us make the bunny hops back to Wise Mind. Once in Wise Mind, we can make good decisions, communicate effectively, and act in ways that have better long-term outcomes.